I was vehemently opposed to Trump, like most, when he first came on the scene.
Has your job been made harder by the incoming of Trump?
I don't think it's meaningful at this point to say I'm a conservative who's opposed to Trump.
Every now and again, I feel like I'm in a space where I'm the conservatives liberal, and Ross, I'm rubbish at it. And so I was just wondering what you would say about being someone that cannot be put neatly into a box.
I've always been a conservative who works and lives around people who disagree with me, which is, I think, a great gift.
Whatever your views are of Joe Rogan, when the most popular podcast host in the whole world starts going to church, you feel like, well, something's happening here.
I've always found it surprising that people aren't religious. Religion is very interesting.
Re-Enchanting podcast, the podcast brought to you by Seen and Unseen. I am Belle Tyndall.
And I'm Justin Briley.
And we're here to talk about that theme of re-enchantment. Have we lost it? Are we craving it? Is the Christian story somewhere where we can find it?
Today, we are re-enchanting belief as a whole concept, really, as we're joined by Ross Douthat. He's a columnist for the New York Times and the author of the recently released book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious. So he's joining us to talk about why, despite what you may have heard, religion is actually quite good for us, and to give some pointers for how the average agnostic might be able to find their way to faith. Welcome along. Thanks for joining us, Ross.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Hi, Ross. I want to speak so much about your book, and even just the title, I'm like, oh gosh, right, let's go. But before we do that, I'm going to restrain myself because we always start the same way on Re-Enchanting, because we're usually recording in Lambeth Palace Library. And so as somewhat of an ode to our home, we always want to know what our guests are reading at the moment.
What am I reading?
We've caught you by surprise.
You've caught me by surprise, but the horrible thing is that since I now am a podcast host myself, I have literally you've as you both know, you do a lot of prep work, tons of prep work. I imagine you've read every book I've ever written, right? So I am in between interviewing Tony Gilroy, I just did yesterday, who's the screenwriter and director who made the Star Wars show Andor. And next I'm interviewing Lina Khan, who is the leading antitrust figure in U.S. politics. And that means that, honestly, everything that I've been reading in the last 4 or 5 days is not a book. I haven't cracked a book. It's other interviews with these figures. It's I just read an article that Lina Khan co-wrote in 2013 about why airline deregulation was bad for America.
Wow.
So that gives you, I guess, I'm trying to be accurate. I could pluck, some thick, weighty tome, but this is the truth. This is the truth of journalism. I often feel that
glamorous life.
Well, I read a lot of books as a young man, and I feel like I'm sort of gradually, using up that accumulated wisdom while I read lots and lots of, interviews and articles.
Well, the reality is when you're hosting a podcast, you kind of you learn the art of speed reading, don't you? Those books of authors where you know enough to be able to ask sensible questions. I'm not saying that's what I've done in this case, Ross, but that's I know that feeling. Well, anyway.
I should say, to actually fit with the themes of the podcast, I am currently reading The Silver Chair by C.S. Lewis to my 6-year-old daughter. So that's a better re-enchantment appropriate answer.
That's very good. That's very good. To be honest, I think you should have an excuse to read Narnia at any age, whether you have children or not. Because I think it just never loses its appeal for some reason. I've just got to that point where my kids, I can still just about get away with reading Narnia to my youngest, but I've kind of got through reading Narnia to all the others, and now I'm like, will I never have an excuse to read Narnia again? And I've just said to myself, you know what? just read it. Why not?
Well, it's also grandchildren. You need to
Yeah.
order up
True,
some
yes,
grandchildren to start all over again.
Anyway, great to have you on the show, Ross. Thank you for joining us. So what does an average week look like for and you can digress or dispute this particular label for yourself, but what does an average week look like for a conservative leaning columnist for the New York Times?
Well, you wake up on Monday morning and put on a raincoat and galoshes because you need to be prepared for all the rotten tomatoes that will be hurled your way as you bicycle to no. I mean, I guess I've given you a dose of the flavor by saying that instead of reading important books, I'm scrabbling through old articles and interviews. But I do a lot of juggling. I currently am supposed to write a newsletter and a column every week and record a podcast where I am the host and interviewer. And then I do a certain amount of, I just wrote a book, so I promote the book, right? I go around and
by
do
coming
other
on amazing podcasts,
other people's podcasts,
yes.
and then we have a meaningful number of children, by religious standards, perhaps not the largest family in the world, but a relatively large family. So I am moving from, so after we record this podcast, I am going to sit down and bang out a newsletter. And then in the afternoon, I will have several. It's the end of the school year, right? So there's, my 8th grader is graduating from 8th grade tonight, and my 9-year-old has a Little League game. And so I'm going to spend an hour trying to figure out the evening's logistics. And then I will turn from that to prepping. Anyway, I mean, I'm not, that is sort of the interesting thing, as you both know, about the profession of journalism, especially nowadays when, there's so many different platforms and audiences to reach, is that you do find yourself sort of moving constantly from not just one task to another, but sort of one level of task to another, right? So my job, I've written this book that is about, I guess, the biggest questions of all, right? Is there a God? What should you do with your life, right? So in one moment, I have to have my mind in that space. In the next moment, you have to have your mind in a space where you can write coherently about the tax provisions of the bill that just passed Congress. And then the moment after that, you have to be in a headspace of, again, like doing logistics for a family of 5 children, which is its own very distinctive kind of task. So my wife and I talk about like the levels. You're always moving between levels, and one minute your mind is in the cosmic level, and the next minute it's in the incredibly granular level of, did we marinate any chicken thighs to grill for dinner tonight? So you're always floating somewhere in there.
Yeah. I, just before we pressed record, marinated some chicken thighs to grill for dinner tonight.
There you go.
What are the chances?
And that is the sign of the cosmic impinging to offer signs and encouragement into the mundane. Right
You're
there.
so right. Look at that. Everything is sacred. I read someone wrote a review for the new, Freddie Hayward wrote a review of your book for the New Statesman, and he called you a the liberals conservative. What does that mean, Ross? I mean, you're not Freddie, so I'm not expecting you to unpack exactly what he meant by that. But that's it. Do you feel that way? That's quite an interesting space to dwell.
Well, I've always been in a version of that space. I'm from Connecticut, which, as UK readers probably know, is part of the northeastern and therefore mostly liberal-leaning portion of the United States. And I, grew up in a household that was sort of historically liberal, democratic, and sort of, developed in unusual directions, in part because we had a bunch of strange religious experiences when I was a kid. But all of that happened while we were still very much inside the culture of, the sort of, liberal upper middle class. And then I went to, a fancy university where I was the token conservative columnist for the fancy university student newspaper. And then I went to Washington, D.C. and became one of the relatively few conservatives working for the liberal-leaning Atlantic magazine. And then I was hired at the New York Times, which, has a very wide and diverse readership, but I think it's fair to say that it leans liberal. So being the liberals' conservative, I think, is just a way of saying that I've always been a conservative who works and lives around people who disagree with me and who writes, not exclusively, but in a substantial way for people who disagree with me, which is, I think, a great gift to have, even though it is occasionally slightly challenging or frustrating or exhausting. But most of the time, if you write, you want to persuade people, right? So the chance to write consistently for people who think that you're full of it is an excellent chance to practice your powers of persuasion. I think the trick with this kind of thing is there are two ways one could be the liberals conservative, right? One could be the conservative who is good at talking to liberals in ways that make them understand the world more completely and understand conservative ideas, even if they don't themselves become conservatives. That's the optimal scenario. The less optimal scenario is that you become a kind of tamed figure, right? Where you're sort of you're kind of like, oh, well, I read 117 liberals and that nice Ross Douthat as well, right? And, and it turns out that even the conservative Ross Douthat, of course, agrees with me that, this thing Donald Trump has done is bad, or this part of the Republican Party is bad, and so on. And the truth is that I do, agree with liberals in some of their critiques of conservatism. But yeah, it's you would lose something important about the task and the vocation if that was sort of what you were reduced to. So I spend a certain amount of time self-consciously trying to be the first kind of liberals conservative and not the second kind, whether or not I actually succeed.
Has your job been made harder by the incoming of Trump and, the groundswell of support from MAGA and so on to be a conservative voice in a largely liberal, progressive kind of publication?
So in certain ways, yes, certainly. I mean, I was, vehemently opposed to Trump, like most conservative newspaper columnists in the United States when he first came on the scene. And, in a way that sort of lent me more credibility with liberal readers, right? It was like, well, this shows that Ross is a decent person after all. He wouldn't go along with this transformation of conservatism and so on. But then it makes the tightrope walk that I was just describing that much harder, right? Where you're constantly trying to say, on the one hand, I am opposed to Donald Trump in these various ways, but I don't want to let my opposition to Donald Trump become the only thing, or my skepticism of him. I don't think it's meaningful at this point to say I'm a conservative who's opposed to Trump, because Trump is, he is almost certainly not going to be up for re-election anymore. We're not having a kind of referendum on Trump all the time. It's better to just say, I'm critical of Trump. But you want to retain a sense of, the ideas that put you on the political right or alienated you from liberalism in the first place. And that's challenging. However, I will also say, though, that Trump's election and re-election and everything else is part of, it's not happening in a vacuum, right? It's part of this larger tectonic shift in Western and global politics that obviously extends to Europe and the UK as well. And that shift, I think, as it has continued, has not simply been reversed, has really profoundly unsettled liberal perspectives on the world. And not falsified them, but so much as demonstrated that the world is changing in ways that the liberalism of the Barack Obama era, to say nothing of the Tony Blair era, right, does not, has not fully reckoned with, right? And that, I think, has made my job easier because I have a bunch of eccentric, peculiar ideas about the world that I think have become much more relevant as the kind of post-Cold War consensus liberalism has been undermined or cracked up. So yeah, navigating, how you think about Trump, how you think about the Republicans, that's very challenging. But the larger world that we're in now, while it's a more chaotic and difficult and dangerous and frightening world in various ways, is a world that is, it offers me a lot of things to write about in a way that, like Barack Obama versus Mitt Romney, right? That was the first election after I took the job at the Times. There was just sort of, I had a lot less to say about that than I do about the world of the 2020s, I think.
As a conservative, but also as a religious person, does that in any way put you at odds with the largely progressive, presumably often secular colleagues you have at the New York Times or just in the journalism sort of media business generally? How are you a bit of an outlier when it comes to your faith?
I am certainly an outlier. As you both know, journalism is a quite secular profession, as professions go in the West. I wouldn't say, though, that it consistently puts me at odds with people I work with or know. I think there are particular points of friction, obviously. I was probably the last columnist for a major American newspaper, for instance, to write anything skeptical about same-sex marriage when it was being legalized in the U.S., right? And so that was obviously like a place where my perspective on the world, obviously informed by Catholicism and Christianity, created some sort of genuine, not just political, but personal tensions, right? So that those things happen. But generally, my sense has always been that hard atheism is just not as potent and powerful a force as it might seem to be if you're sort of on the outside of the secular establishment looking in. And it has become, and this is one of the, something that is familiar from both of your work, right, and is part of the argument that sort of frames my own book, right? But over time, over the last 10 or 15 years, I think the secular perspective has become steadily less confident, less certain of itself, less militant. I joined the Times at sort of the high tide of the new atheism when my own Catholic Church's sex abuse crisis was sort of in the news every day, and that was challenging, right? But by the 2020s, most people I know who are intelligent and sincere and secular don't look at my religious faith and say, oh, why does Ross believe a lot of nonsense? They look at my faith with sort of a mix of bemusement, puzzlement, sometimes hostility, sometimes interest, right? It's just a very complex, it's a very complex relationship. But I think even that has always been true, even at peak Richard Dawkins, right? Yeah. Even at peak Richard Dawkins, most people who were secular were not fully invested in some kind of absolute hostility to religion. In part, that's just not how human beings are, I think.
Before this is touching upon both of your books, actually. This is the sweet spot in the Venn diagram of both of your most recent books. And before we get there, I just want to very quickly draw out a little piece of gold from you. I sometimes think that or I sometimes feel like I'm the opposite. Every now and again, I feel like I'm in a space where I'm the conservative liberal, and Ross, I'm rubbish at it. And I think I am not good at playing that role. And I think from hearing you speak, but also reading some of your work and reading what others say about you, what you seem to be able to do is engage with the best of an argument that you disagree with.
That's the theory, yes.
Yeah,
whether or not it's achieved is another question.
Okay,
but
that's
yes.
the aim. That's the aim. And so I was just wondering then, before we move on to sort of your book and conversations around faith and things, just what you would say about being someone that cannot be put neatly into a box, that maybe stands somewhat aslant, and that tries to engage with the best of an argument you disagree with.
Well, I mean, I will say that is what I try to do. And I do, I think very self-consciously think about it as a kind of vocational work, right? That it is, to put it in Christian or religious terms, right? It is very unlikely that, the full truth about the universe as revealed by God in his infinite wisdom has been perfectly captured and distilled by one particular ideology or one particular worldview in, 21st century America, right? And so having that perspective should make you assume that, even the person who you think is really, really wrong in most cases is probably getting something right. And the side that you think is mostly right is probably getting something wrong. And then when you have kind of messed up, muddled politics like we have now, where, again, this is somewhat less true in Europe, but I think somewhat true in Europe as well. But, in the United States, whole factions in our politics have basically switched sides in the last 10 years or so, right? So when I was a kid, again, my family was liberal, and we were around a lot of crunchy, holistic people, like, people who were into health food and, what gets disparagingly called woo, people who didn't vaccinate their kids, all these kind of things. We knew a bunch of people like this, right? And they were all on the left. They were crunchy, hippie, children of the 1960s, and so on, right? That was just a left-wing way of being in the world. Today, if you describe a bunch of people that way, there's a very good chance that they voted for Donald Trump, love Robert F. Kennedy Jr., right, and have ended up sort of as skeptics of the scientific establishment on the political right. And that's just very interesting. Right? It's a very interesting development. But it should also, I think, make you kind of humble about the judgments that you make on a consistent basis about this is what right-wing people are like, this is what left-wing people are like, right? And you can have a judgment, you can do a thing where you say, well, I hated those crunchy hippies when they were on the left, and I hate them now that they're on the right. You can do that, right? But they were people that I knew, and perhaps even people I was related to, right? And I have had plenty of experiences in my life that have given me an awareness of where that perspective on the world comes from, right? But at the same time, I've had plenty of experiences that give me a sense of where the sort of pro-science, pro-vaccine, anti-hippie nonsense perspective on the world comes from. And it just seems like it's challenging, but it actually shouldn't be that challenging to sort of look at different constellations of ideas, see how they migrate around, see how different people pick them up, see how distinctive pressures happen, like a pandemic, right, that suddenly shake up people's perspectives and move people around. And out of that, to have a certain kind of charity for, and ideally affection for. And I think this is really the key goal. You want to figure out how to have affection for different factions, not just sort of say, okay, I can understand how they came to that position, but think of a person who holds those views who you like. That's I think just a really useful discipline. Now, I will say lastly that there is a temptation here, right? A temptation to be sort of overly understanding. And I think this is sort of, when the criticism of my own style that I take most seriously sort of takes this view. It says, look, okay, you're trying to be understanding. You're always trying to analyze these different constellations of ideas from a distance, right? But sometimes these ideas are in power and need to be more harshly critiqued and opposed. And your kind of style of understanding is a problem for that. So, like, I'm very friendly with Andrew Sullivan, who is a gay, Catholic, libertarian, pugilistic, Irish English American, right? Like a great character of journalism. And Andrew and I probably have similar takes on both Trump and wokeness, right? But when Andrew criticizes Trump, or when he criticizes wokeness, so he's, punching right and punching left, he turns the dial all the way, right? when he's anti-wokeness, it is the new totalitarianism, and it's the, he's taken it down. And when he criticizes Trump, it's, incipient tyranny and the end of democracy and so on. And I hardly ever turn the dial, even when I agree with Andrew, I hardly ever turn the dials quite that far. And I think that's partially reflects the position that I occupy and who I write for and so on. But I remember I went on Andrew's podcast once. It was sort of the high tide of wokeness. And he was like, Ross, what are you doing? This is, you agree with me. You've got to go a bit further, right? You've got to get angry, right? And I think it is a fair point that the ironic, I have understood you kind of style, maybe there are moments when you fail to get as angry as you should about a particular thing, which is also part of your obligation as a journalist.
I enjoyed the Andrew Sullivan imitation.
Sorry,
accent as well.
It's you can judge my.
It was like I was talking to Andrew for a moment. No, but seriously though, that's really helpful, and I think you'll find yourself in the same position as so many people in our polarized worlds. Trying to, as you said earlier, walk that tightrope. Just before we jump into Believe, the book, where did your own belief come from? What's sort of a thumbnail sketch, if you like, of your own faith journey?
So I mentioned this in passing already, but when I was a kid, I was raised Episcopalian originally, which is, a declining form of mainline Protestantism in the United States. Obviously the similar position to some degree as Anglicanism in the UK, except without the monarch as head of the church. And my parents were sort of Christians to some degree when I was little. That's probably how I would describe it. And then when I was about 7 years old, we were pulled into the world of charismatic Christianity and spent the next, 7 to 8 years sort of in Pentecostalist and charismatic worlds that were just very, very intense, like, speaking in tongues, intercessory and healing prayer, people getting slain in the spirit, in different contexts. Like we spent most of our time in a healing ministry where there was a woman who was sort of the whatever supernatural goings on were there, she was sort of the focus. But then we also, sort of went out into wider Pentecostalist worlds where you'd have kind of a revivalist thing where there was this kind of spiritual energy around that wasn't attached to any particular person, was just like a ball rolling around the room. And obviously I've ended up with a fairly cerebral and intellectual style of faith, and the book I've written is filled with arguments about how to think your way into belief. But realistically, the grounding of my faith is in those early experiences. But with this crucial twist, they were not my experiences. I am, for now at least, not really a mystical personality. I did not, you could line up 10 people in a row and someone prays over them and 9 of them fall down, and I did not, right? And I think you can imagine someone having that experience as a kid and coming away a total skeptic, right? Like it never happened to me, therefore it wasn't real. I had sort of the opposite perspective. I was certain it was real, whatever it was, right? Whatever sort of dogmatic definition you place on it, something real was happening that was outside the realm of, normal, everyday secular experience that cried out for some kind of explanation. And so I've always been very interested in religious traditions and ideas that try to enfold the weird and the mystical into a rational and sort of a theological system that tries to be consistent and rigorous and make sense, right? And we ended up as Catholics, and sort of its own separate story, right? But I always appreciated in Catholicism this sense that, like, yes, this is a very intellectually serious tradition. We all read Thomas Aquinas and brag about how, we had this unbroken line going back to the church fathers of putting faith and reason together and so on. But then Catholicism is also filled with weird stuff, right? Bleeding statues, levitating saints, just sort of crazy mysticism that's, again, enfolded into that that structure. So yeah, I think you can see my entire faith perspective as rooted in being someone who wants to reason about the mystical and sort of put those things together. And that obviously, like many things in life, goes back to things that happened to me when I was 8 or 9 years old.
I'm really getting a sense that you like the tricky jobs. you like the tight lines.
Well, it's the interesting.
Trying to put reason to the mystical.
I do, but it's also.
Yeah.
It seems to me to be worth doing, right?
Yeah,
and
sure.
and I mean, look, everyone. One of the things you realize, if you didn't know it already, right, is when you start making arguments about the reasonability of religious belief or anything like that, you have a lot of conversations where everyone is just coming from from different perspectives on the stuff, right? And you'll have people, you'll have people who will say, well, if you want to tell me about fine tuning or consciousness or these things as arguments for design or God, I'm with you. But once you start talking about miracles, you lose me completely, right? Then you'll have people for whom it's the reverse. People who are like, come on, don't give me this scientific, hugger mugger and so on. If God is real, you're only going to get it through, this kind of direct experience. Why are you trying to reason about this stuff, right? And so there's all kinds of different ways and experiences out there. But to me, putting it together is that's the interesting challenge. I do want the world to fit together, right? It should fit together, and I'm interested in how it might.
Something that struck me out of just what you said of your own journey, sort of this interesting phase through the weirdness of Pentecostalism and charismatic expression of Christianity, to where you find yourself now in a more sort of arguably intellectual tradition, but with its own weirdness, Catholicism. That interestingly reflects some of what a recent survey, I'm sure you've come across it, Ross, in the UK is saying. The Quiet Revival was published a couple of months ago and showing that there has been an upturn, interestingly, in an otherwise story of decline. There's been an upturn of religiosity, church-going in the UK, especially among young people. And the areas that seem to be benefiting the most are the Pentecostal wing and the Catholic wing of the church. And it is that kind of, again, to quote you earlier, that Episcopalian, perhaps more kind of liberal middle that's not seeing the benefit necessarily of this. So, I mean, does that reflect in any way your own journey or what you're seeing happen as well? And I'd just be interested in what your take is of what's happening on your side of the pond when it comes to the possible revival of Christianity in that way.
Yes, I mean, yes, I think that does seem to be, in a way, not just a Western story, but kind of a global story, right? That, the biggest growth in Christianity around the world by far is in Pentecostalist, charismatic, evangelical churches that are often non-denominational, not affiliated with traditional Protestant denominations. Both traditional Protestant denominations and Roman Catholicism are losing ground to those forms of Christianity, but the sort of more liberal and kind of sort of self-consciously modernized institutional churches seem to be losing ground faster. And there seems to be more resilient, like if you're looking for institutional resilience, you will tend to find it in places that emphasize the liturgical traditional theology, and so on, right? And that doesn't mean that everyone's becoming conservative. I think you have certain forms of non-denominational Christianity that look quite liberal in their own way, sort of seeker sensitive, not heavy on theology, not hyper moralistic, right? But they're following a more kind of entrepreneurial and frankly American style model than the United Methodists or Congregationalists and so on, right? It seems like the sort of highly institutionalized Protestant denominations that flourished from the 17th century through the early 20th century have been hit hardest by this. In the US, you have, I think the UK may end up in this place too, notwithstanding Anglicanism's traditional role, but you have this very curious phenomenon, I think, in many ways, where, to the extent that there is a potent religion among the American elite. It is increasingly clearly Catholicism, right? Like there is just this sort of recurring stereotype that reflects reality of, the young evangelical or sometimes mainline Protestant who, goes off to college, goes to graduate school, becomes more religious, and just ends up, maybe they pass through some halfway houses. They're, evangelical Anglican for a while, or, but they end up Catholic, right? And this yields, in conservative politics especially, a really strong Catholic presence, like in, the sort of, it's not a coincidence that all but one of the Supreme Court justices in the American Supreme Court are Catholic, and one is a Catholic turned Episcopalian, right, which is the, sort of the outlier. It's not a coincidence. Like if you look at like who staffs the Trump administration, I'm sure you would find many, many more observant Catholics than you would other faith traditions. But it even has some truth in the more secular Democratic side. The Biden administration had lots and lots of Catholics working for it and relatively few white Protestants, which was itself a notable phenomenon. So you have this increasingly Catholic elite, but then Catholicism as a mass religion in the US is not doing especially well. It's seeing some of the same decline as mainline churches, right? And almost all of the growth is in non-denominational Christianity. So it's just this curious thing where America is, historically and still now an intensely Protestant country, even if you're not actually a Protestant, right? Like this is sort of fundamental to American identity. The churches that were associated with that Protestantism are in total decline and eclipse. There's a kind of mass Protestantism where people don't even identify as Protestant anymore. That's an interesting thing you see in polls. Lots of young people who are Protestants, they will just say I'm Christian, right? Like the very term Protestant is sort of falling into disuse, right? So you have this large Christian non-Catholic culture out there, but then you get to Washington D.C., you get to New York, and so on, and the Christians are Catholic. There's some people converting to Eastern Orthodoxy, right? There's some sort of curious liturgical experiments. But it's just a very interesting dynamic, and not at all what you would have expected if you rolled the clock back to 1955 and said, back then you would have had people say, oh, Catholicism as a mass religion is going to take over America. It's going to, keep growing quickly, and our Presbyterian and Congregationalist elite needs to hold this Catholic mass at bay. But instead, it's sort of flipped over, and Catholicism is an elite religion. In what is still a mostly Protestant society. So it's fascinating, but I don't know where it goes from here. I don't know.
That's very interesting. I guess the question that I'm wondering then is sort of the secularism of maybe 20 plus years ago. Our podcast is called Re-Enchanting, which is riffing off Max Weber's theory of disenchantment, that the age to come would be defined by disenchantment of the natural world. And then, that gets expanded to disenchantment of all things. So I'm wondering, would you say that was a blip? Disenchantment, I think there was a lot of truth in what Max Weber predicted, but I'm wondering if it was a detour rather than a destination, and we were always going to come back into sort of a more enchanted worldview. But I'd love to take your read on that.
Yes, I mean, I have complicated feelings about these arguments, because part of me wants to say that enchantment has always been a bit of a myth. Right? Disenchantment has always been a bit of a myth. Okay. And that's sort of a natural thing for me to say as someone who grew up in the quote-unquote disenchanted 1980s watching my parents speak in tongues on weekends, right? Like how disenchanted were the 1960s when everyone got into, when the Beatles went and sat at the feet of a guru in India, right? So there is a way in which enchantment, I think, has just persisted. It's just a fact of human experience that people have mystical experiences, whether they want them or not. They seek them out. They desire them, even in a context where organized religion is in decline. There's no shortage of potential miracles for would-be canonizations of Catholic saints. It's not like we've run out of peculiar healings associated with praying for saintly intercession. question, right? Like, enchantment persists. At the same time, Weber is obviously describing something real, and the way I think of it is there is a disenchantment of sort of elite knowledge, elite ways of thinking, elite sort of information production.
Yeah.
Right. So I'm recording this from New Haven, Connecticut. I'm right next to Yale University. If you walk over to Yale Law School and spend a lot of time, talking to law professors and reading the things they write and so on, like, that's a disenchanted world. The supernatural does not enter into the world of Yale Law School and Yale Medical School. And if you read like sort of popular productions that are trying to associate themselves with official knowledge, if you read like, Wikipedia entries on things that have a supernatural component, clearly the bias of the Wikipedia writer is to always take the side of the debunker and the would-be disenchanter, because that's what you do when you're doing official knowledge. So I think the question now, when we talk about re-enchantment, my friend Rod Dreher wrote a book about this, right? It is very much in the air. And I think what is in the air is this sense that like that carapace of official knowledge has a lot of cracks in it, and people are sort of acknowledging the cracks and watching weird things sort of leak through, and they're not sure exactly what, how to think about them. And there's a lot of stuff in this zone that is sort of on the borderland between science fiction, and the supernatural. The entire UFO fascination, everything to do with psychedelics is sort of in this zone where people are sort of saying, well, we've got this kind of quasi-supernatural realm, but maybe it still fits into the material frame, but maybe it doesn't. There's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty about that. One of the most popular podcasts in America right now is called the Telepathy Tapes, right? And it's, this woman claiming that...
I've listened to it myself, Ross,
yes.
And it is quite mind-blowing, actually.
It's quite mind-blowing. There are some pretty strong critiques.
Yeah. Okay.
To me, it's an example of, to me, it raises what I think is a key question going forward, which is just how far can re-enchantment go, right? Like, I think for re-enchantment to sort of go all the way, you need to reach some level where some element of the supernatural becomes not undeniable, because nothing is undeniable, but like something that can sort of achieve a kind of consensus, right? So if you go back to, the Middle Ages, right, there's a consensus of, intelligent, serious people in medieval England that miracles can happen. That was the consensus. Now there's a consensus the other way. Can you imagine a world where enough strange things happened that the consensus switched back? I think you can, but you would need those things. You would need that. Basically, you would need the strangeness to accelerate a little bit more, right? So I love the book by Carlos Ayer that you guys are probably familiar with. They Flew. It's this book about levitating saints in the Reformation era, right? And the point that Ayer makes is that, the historical, if you just ignore the fact that these are supernatural happenings, the historical evidence for the levitating saints is really strong, right? Tons of witnesses, people coming from all over, different sources, right? Like, if it was a natural event, everyone would agree that it happened. Because it's a supernatural event, one can be skeptical. But I think the reasonable thing for the skeptic to say reading that book is, okay, where are the levitating saints of, 2025, right? And obviously if you had them, people would say it was deep fakes and so on, right? But like, you could imagine a world where suddenly we got a few more levitating saints, and then you'd really have re-enchantment, right? But for now, we have just enough supernaturalism to sort of crack the carapace, crack the, I don't know what metaphor I'm using, but sort of create some cracks in that official consensus, but not enough that the skeptics can't say in the end, like, there's just not enough here for me to leave materialism behind.
I very much see your book, Believe, Why Everyone Should Be Religious, sort of as doing that job that you just mentioned of giving people a bit of a guide to how to navigate this tricky subject of enchantment, religion, belief, for those, who potentially are interested, curious, maybe open in a way they weren't 15 or 20 years ago in the heyday of new atheism. But even I think for, the pretty hardened skeptic, I think you're trying to make the case. You're trying to do that, always be ready to give an answer to anyone who asks you about the reason for the hope that you have, that First Peter 3:15 principle. And to that extent, how much are you relying in this book on sort of, as you said, those intellectual arguments for God? And how much are you sort of just recommending Christianity or religion in general because of its how good it is for people? I mean, I see part of the upturn of interest in Christianity that there is in the West at the moment, to be honest, more down to the fact that people are saying, well, this could be really good for us, not necessarily the question of whether it's true or not.
Absolutely. And I am trying to not, very, very self-consciously, not write in that zone and space. I think the book takes for granted that religion has a bunch of social benefits, and there is a part of the book where I'm arguing for why, if you take religious ideas seriously, you should join an institution, right? Not just sort of be a religious freelancer, not do it on your own. And there, some of those arguments become more important, right? But the frame of the book is basically saying, look, we're in an age when a lot of people are interested in faith again, are looking at faith anew, turning back to faith. And a lot of them are doing it for the reasons that you described, that it seems to be good for you, that it seems to deliver a sense of meaning and purpose and moral guidance in a world where the secular alternatives don't seem to be doing a good job of that. But there still is this kind of overhang for a lot of people where they feel like they're turning back to religion, but they're doing it in defiance of their reason. They're leaving sort of, modernity and science behind. They're, taking a pure leap of faith and so on. And obviously there is an aspect of religious belief and practice that is about a personal relationship. It's about God's grace. It's not something you can reason your way into. But I think that underneath that, there is a foundation of basic reasonability that people should feel confident in, meaning that as you go through life, you have ebbs and flows. You have periods when, your faith tradition is working for you, and periods when it's not. You have there's nobody has a simple linear religious path through life. But what I want people to feel is that underneath all of those perturbations and rises and falls and dark nights of the soul and so on, there's just a basic good set of reasons why a religious perspective on the world makes sense, is very likely to be true, and therefore, even in times of difficulty and doubt, being sort of engaged religiously, trying to practice a religion, trying to figure out where you're supposed to be religiously, is never an unreasonable thing to do. It's always, it's always the more serious option than just sort of either assuming that there's no God or just always sitting on the sidelines. Now, that doesn't mean that I think that there's one slam dunk argument for why you should be religious. And what I was saying earlier about the levitating saints, you could imagine a world where suddenly there was one slam dunk argument. Go look at the levitating saint, right? But in the world we're in right now, I think it is much more a matter of converging lines. And that's sort of what the book is, the first part of the book at least, is trying to do, to say, look, there's a set of arguments from and evidence from what we know about the physical universe. There's a set of arguments about and evidence from what we know about consciousness, human consciousness, and there's a set of arguments around, mystical and religious experience and its persistence and resilience. And a religious perspective just makes sense. It makes those different things fit together. It makes sense of them in a parsimonious way, whereas the materialist perspective, the non-religious perspective, is trying to run around and sort of fix things at each level. It's like, all right, well, to explain, the evidence of cosmic design, we're going to posit an infinite number of invisible universes. Okay, we've taken care of that problem. Now we have to figure out how to explain consciousness, and we're going to have to posit that consciousness is an illusion, that, is sort of emerges in some mysterious way from the mind. Okay, that's consciousness. Religious experience. Well, it turns out that even though consciousness is an illusion, it also has this deep Jungian architecture that's capable of generating all these experiences and so on. And it's not that I can say that any of those arguments is 100% wrong, but I do think that they are very clearly sort of trying to, sort of working much harder than the religious person has to work to explain the actual physical and psychological and experiential world that we find ourselves in.
Yeah, it's quite Pascalian of you. I'm thinking, we had Graham Tomlin also on this series, and he's just written a biography of Pascal, and so Pascal's on my mind. And Pascal's famous wager, where everyone, where he's sort of putting he's saying basically, if you were only working from the rational and you were to place a bet on whether a god exists or not, you would go for he does exist. So Graham argues that what Pascal's really trying to do is to say that if you're falling on the other side, there's a reason for that, and the reason isn't reason. The reason has more to do with your passions. So is there a bit of that?
Yes, I mean, you hesitate to associate yourself with one of the greatest, the
Oh,
greatest minds of the.
Go on.
I think in popular discourse, and I don't think this is quite fair to Pascal, but in popular discourse, Pascal's wager is often framed as, even if there's only a 1% chance that there's a god, the stakes are so high, right, that if there's no god, you've lost nothing. And a 1% bet might pay off eternally, so you should make it, right? And I think the weakness of that is even if it's mathematically true, it's hard to persuade people to change their lives for the sake of a 1% probability. Yeah. And you do need at a certain point to get I do think a wager, it is a wager, right? You make wagers on worldviews. We don't have perfect knowledge. Any worldview you have is in a way a kind of bet on what is the nature of reality and our capacity to understand it. But I am intent on trying to persuade people that if you make the wager on religion, it's not a 1% wager. Maybe it's a 77% wager. Maybe it's, I think the chances that, I think it's different at different levels. Like there's the wager on Christianity, and then there's the wager against materialism. I think the wager against materialism, just in terms of if I was just laying betting odds, is really, really, really strong. I am quite certain that Daniel Dennett is wrong about the nature of reality. Maybe he's right, and I would say I'll find out, but I won't find out if he's right. That's the thing. But I feel like that's a bet I'm making at 97-3 or something. When you get to the specifics of the Christian revelation and Jesus and so on, if you're framing it in betting terms, there's a certain risk of impiety, right, in doing that. But I think it would be silly to say, the resurrection of Jesus is also a 99% bet. I wouldn't say that. But I do think you want to persuade people that it's not just a long shot bet, because I think that's how people think about it a lot. They're like, yes, I'm going to be religious, and in becoming religious, I'm making this really long shot bet that I know is probably wrong, but the payoff is so high, I'm going to do it. And I'm saying it's actually a better bet than that. You're probably going to win. Good news.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, how do you then speak to the person who says, but okay, I'm not this hard-headed Daniel Dennett type materialist atheist. I think maybe there's something out there, my experiences seem to speak to that and so on. But how do you then, is it then just, again, religious roulette saying, well, Christianity's the right one versus Buddhism, Islam, Judaism, or any of the other thousands of religions that exist? I mean, in your book, as far as I understand it, Ross, you're actually quite in favour of just being religious in general. You say that's better than not being religious, but obviously you do hold to a very specific view of religion. And
yes, and I'm a bit trying to have it both ways, and this is again a sort of critique and somewhat fair one that I've received, right? Where I want to simultaneously say, look, it's if you think probabilistically that there's probably a God, human beings are probably here for a reason, then even if you aren't 100% certain about the truth claims of any particular religion, you're better off inside a big, serious, ancient one than you are out there freelancing on your own. So if I cannot 100% convince you to join my religion, I still would like you to join the institutional faith that's closest to hand. I think that's a more rational choice that's likely, not always, but in many cases likely to bear more fruit in your life than just sort of doing things on your own. At the same time, I also want to say that it is important to take seriously the differences between religions and, you know, think that you can get to a point of saying, I think this one is more likely to be true than that one, and make your choices that way. And I do think, obviously, that Christianity is more likely to be true than the other alternatives. And I end the book with, you know, a book that is not a work of Christian apologetics. Nonetheless, I end it with some fairly straightforward Christian apologetics about why the gospel narratives in particular stand out among all the different religious stories and traditions and so on. But I guess my view is partially that there is a certain degree of convergence between the major world religions. It's not at all total. There are huge differences and distinctions, clearly, right? But across both East and West, there is a general sense that there are higher supernatural powers. There are supernatural powers that don't have your good in mind, and there are supernatural powers that do. There is a moral approach to the world that brings you into harmony with the supernatural powers that do have your good in mind. This is what C.S. Lewis, since we started out talking about him, calls the Tao in, is it The Abolition of Man, where he talks? Yeah. Which is there's sort of a common moral vision that the big world religions do seem to have converged upon. And there are overlaps even in religions that seem quite different, like Buddhism and Christianity, right? Like there are conceptions of the Buddha that do have sort of some overlaps with Christian conceptions of Jesus and the Trinity and so on, right? And all of that suggests to me, and this is where I am kind of a liberal, right, that God is at work God is at work in many different religious traditions, and there is a divine nature that each religion is groping towards, and the religions that have been around a long time and sort of survived big civilizational changes and so on are all probably getting at some aspect of the truth in a way that a random cult that has started in a Californian basement yesterday is less likely to do. So there is this way in which you are likely to be closer to God in any of these big old traditions because of their convergences than you are, again, sort of starting off on your own. But at the same time, they have big differences, and one of them is probably truer than the others. And it makes sense to sit down. I advise this straightforwardly, right? Like, sit down, read the New Testament, read the Quran, read some of the Bhagavad Gita, and see what you think, right? Like this is again, if you're starting from zero, right? Most people aren't starting from zero, but if you're starting from zero, that is in fact a perfectly legitimate and reasonable thing to do. Read some of the major scriptures of the major world religions and see which one seems most compelling and historically credible to you. And that I think both of those things can coexist, but there is a kind of like, there's a certain degree of having it both ways that I am aware is an issue, right? And especially my more stringently evangelical Christian readers and friends have sort of, they've been like, "Wait, really? You think it's okay if someone ends up a Hindu Ross? Come on, that's not." That's I think a valid question.
I can understand that. I mean, obviously, you do obviously end with a kind of a case for Christian faith in particular.
Yes.
And what's interesting to me, whether it be because it's, as you say, the closest tradition at hand, or because they find something rather compelling in it, is we do seem to be living at a time when a lot of interesting people are interestingly converting to Christianity. As you know, this is part of what my book and podcast series has been about, as well as the general rise in interest. I mean, have you found that interesting, surprising yourself to see people like, Joe Rogan, I heard recently, has started attending church, and when whatever your views are of Joe Rogan, when the most popular podcast host in the whole world starts going to church, you feel like, well, something's happening here, isn't it?
Yes, I think the question to me, the sociological question, is how far does it go, right? And I was just reading a statistical critique of the quiet revival statistics that you mentioned earlier, right? There's sort of open questions about, how substantial is the actual revival. The language I use for America is that we're not having a religious revival, we're considering whether to have one.
I really like that.
I think there's I think this is a very uncertain moment when you have people sort of experimenting with faith anew. You have people sort of in this kind of weird liminal Jordan Peterson-esque zone where they're debating atheists but don't want to commit too much, right? And then you have a lot of people experimenting outside of traditional religion who are very much in the I'm taking psychedelics, I'm opening myself up to visitors from Alpha Centauri kind of mode, and that's a really important part of the culture too. And from my perspective, perhaps a quite dangerous part, and a reason to again sort of press the argument for institutional forms of religion. But all of that is sort of in the air. As to whether I find it surprising, I guess to me, like and this is a conviction that has hardened with age or strengthened with age, right? But the thing I said before about thinking materialism is almost certainly false, because I think materialism is always almost certainly false, I've always found it surprising that people aren't religious, right? I don't find it surprising that people aren't, showing up for, every Catholic holy day of obligation and like practicing faith in some intense way. Practicing faith in an intense way is really hard, and modern society puts up all kinds of impediments to it. And a lack of like intense piety has never surprised me. But the fact that lots of people are just sort of content to drift along as sort of agnostics with a materialist bias and so on, I've never completely understood that. So a revival of interest in religion confirms my priors. I'm like, yeah, well, of course people are interested in religion. Religion is very interesting.
Yeah. It's almost like, so the byline to your book is why everyone should be religious. I feel like speaking to it could almost be like, believe, why the heck wouldn't you be? Like, why aren't you? Why would anyone not be?
There is a hint, just a hint of exasperation, I think, in some of my arguments. I'm still generally, people say, oh, you're very understanding about the atheist perspective and so on. I think I am mildly or not so mildly frustrated with both hard materialism and also the people who are like, well, maybe there's something out there, but I'm not going to pursue it. Like, I mean, and again, pursuit, like, how hard do I pursue, like, really intensely? No, you asked me about, my week. Getting the kids, the baseline of getting 5 kids to Sunday Mass is sort of sometimes it's the extent of my Christian practice in a given week. So I have lots of sympathy for the bad and lazy and unsuccessful Christian, but the person who purports not to care at all, I'm like, I don't understand that. Yeah, or not completely.
Yeah. Oh, Ross, this has been so much fun.
Yeah, it's been great.
I have enjoyed picking your brains tremendously.
So have I, Ross. So have
Good.
I.
Well, it's been a lot of fun. Yeah. It's been a lot of fun for me as well. And thank you so much for having me.
And we should say the book is available now.
It is
doing really well from what I can see. Believe Why Everyone Should Be Religious. We'll make sure there's a link to it, obviously, from today's show. So go and check that out. Yeah, and thanks for coming on, being our guest, and for re-enchanting belief for us today, Ross.
You're very welcome. Yeah. Thanks to you both.
That's no small task we gave you, actually. And thank you to everyone who's listening. I have no doubt you've also found this conversation just so rich and deep and thought-provoking. And so thank you for being here. seenandunseen.com/give is now and ever the place to go if you want to make future conversations like this happen. But for now, we will say goodbye.
God bless. Goodbye.